I was 17 when my mother and I moved to Bellevue, Washington. It was the fall of 2017, and the air carried that particular crispness you only notice when the leaves are starting to let go of their branches. My parents' marriage had just unraveled, and my mother decided a fresh start would heal us both. She found a modest rental in a quiet cul-de-sac. The place wasn't grand. 3 bedrooms, faded yellow siding, a fence that leaned a little to the left. But to her, it was a promise of stability. To me, it was just another reminder that nothing would ever be the same again. I remember unpacking boxes in my new bedroom, watching Bella, my golden retriever, run circles around the fenced backyard. She was my anchor, my best friend since I was 12. I trusted her more than anyone. People had disappointed me too many times already. My father's absence was still raw, and even my mother's optimism sometimes felt like a lie. But Bella's wagging tail never betrayed me. The neighborhood looked perfect on the surface. Manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, and families waving at each other as they drove past. It seemed so normal it almost hurt. But it didn't take long for that illusion to crack. On our second evening, I heard a knock at the door. When I opened it, a girl about my age stood there with a plate of cookies. She had long brown hair, a pale face dotted with freckles, and a smile that looked a little too rehearsed. "Hi, I'm Jessica. I live right next door," she chirped. "And you must be Chloe." I nodded, taken aback by her confidence. "Yeah, we just moved in." "I know." She tilted her head slightly, eyes flicking past me into the living room. "It's so nice to finally have someone my age here. It gets boring, just me and my brother most nights." Her voice was friendly, almost too much. She asked if I liked the school, what bus I planned to take, what classes I was in. She even asked where my mom worked, what my dad did, and if Bella was left outside during the day. I laughed it off, thinking she was just overeager. But even as I smiled and thanked her for the cookies, something unsettled me. Her eyes didn't match her smile. They lingered too long, sharp and curious, like she wasn't just making small talk, like she was studying me. That night, as I sat on my bed scrolling through my phone, I heard a faint whistle outside. Bella's ears perked up. She padded to the window and growled softly. When I pulled back the curtain, I saw Jessica leaning over the fence, whistling and tossing a stick for Bella. She waved at me when she noticed, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Just saying hi," she called out. I closed the curtain. Something about her energy didn't feel like friendliness. It felt like intrusion. Maybe it was paranoia from everything else going on in my life. My mother kept saying this move was about starting over, and I wanted to believe her. But as the days passed, I realized some things follow you no matter where you run. And sometimes the thing waiting for you is standing right on the other side of the fence. School became my escape. I threw myself into routines, joined study groups, and found comfort in the chatter of classmates who didn't know anything about my past. But Jessica was always there when I came home. She'd appear at our door uninvited, sometimes holding a plate of brownies, other times with random questions. Once she asked if I could help her with geometry. Another time she wanted me to go on a walk late at night because she was too scared to go alone. I tried to be polite at first. After all, she was my neighbor, and I didn't want to start problems. But the more time I spent around her, the more I noticed her intensity. She'd lean in too close when she spoke. She'd memorize things I'd casually mentioned, like how I always drank chamomile tea before bed, or that my mom worked until 6 most nights. One afternoon as I came home from school, I saw Jessica sitting on our porch steps with Bella. She was stroking her fur, whispering something I couldn't hear. Bella wasn't growling, but her ears were flat against her head, and that told me everything. Bella never liked people who gave off bad vibes. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile. "What are you doing here?" Jessica looked up, her face lighting up as if she'd been caught in something innocent. "Oh, Bella was just lonely. I figured I'd keep her company." I forced a laugh, but my stomach twisted. Bella wasn't lonely. She had her toys, her bed, her routine. She didn't need Jessica. After that, I started avoiding her. I ignored her texts, which grew in number every day. They started simple. Want to hang out? You never answer anymore. Then they shifted. Fake friends don't last. I saw you leave this morning, didn't even wave. By the time she wrote, Bella looks so cute sleeping near the window. Be careful, some people might take her. I felt my chest lock with fear. She couldn't have known that unless she'd been watching. That night I pulled down the blinds and sat awake until dawn. Bella slept on my bed, her body warm against mine, her breathing steady. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was outside standing in the shadows waiting. When I told my mom, she brushed it off. Jess probably just wants a friend. Maybe she doesn't know how to show it right. But I knew the difference between clingy and dangerous, and Jessica was tipping the scale. The real breaking point came one chilly November evening. I had stayed late at school for a project and came home around 6. When I opened the gate, Bella came limping toward me, whining. My heart dropped. I rushed her to the vet, who said she'd been struck hard, maybe kicked. There were no broken bones, but the injury was deliberate. Someone had hurt her. Driving home, my hands shook on the steering wheel. I wanted to believe it was an accident, but the image of Jessica in my yard, whistling at Bella, haunted me. I confronted her the next day. She was sitting on her porch, sipping a soda. Did you hurt my dog? I demanded. Her eyes widened and she laughed. What? No. Chloe, I'd never... Why would you think that? Because you're always in my yard, I snapped. You're always around when you shouldn't be. Her face shifted. For a split second, the cheerful mask cracked. Maybe if you were a better friend, I wouldn't have to show up uninvited. The words hit me like ice. I turned and walked away, Bella tugging at her leash. That night, I heard footsteps on gravel outside my window. Bella growled low in her throat. I pulled the blinds shut and sat frozen, listening. At 2 a.m., I woke to a soft tapping sound. My stomach dropped. Peeking through the blinds, I saw a figure in a hoodie standing in the yard, staring up at my window. My breath caught. I dialed 911, whispering to the operator. Bella barked, her teeth bared, ready to protect me. By the time the police arrived, the figure was gone. They searched the yard, found the fence gate ajar, and told us to be careful. Get some cameras, one officer advised. I wanted to believe it was just a prank, a random trespasser, but deep down I already knew the truth. It wasn't random. It was next door. My mom finally agreed to install cameras. The system recorded both the front and backyard. For 2 nights, nothing happened. I started to wonder if maybe I was imagining the worst. On the 3rd night, we saw him. Tyler, Jessica's older brother. The footage showed him crouching near the fence, tossing something into the yard. When I checked the grass the next morning, I found raw meat. At first, it seemed harmless, until I noticed glints of glass embedded inside. I felt sick. Bella had sniffed it, but thankfully hadn't eaten it. We called the police immediately. They reviewed the footage, and within hours, Tyler was arrested for stalking, harassment, and animal cruelty. Jessica cried when they took him away. She came running over, mascara streaking down her face. I didn't know, she sobbed. Chloe, I swear I didn't know he was doing this. He told me you were his friend. I stared at her, but the words felt hollow. She had been there all along, asking questions, watching, making excuses. Maybe she hadn't known every detail, but she knew enough. And she chose to stay silent. After Tyler's arrest, the cul-de-sac never felt the same. Neighbors whispered, pretending to be shocked. But part of me wondered how many of them had noticed the strange behavior and looked the other way. Bella recovered slowly, limping for a while before regaining her energy. But I never let her out alone again. I couldn't. At night, even with Tyler gone, I struggled to sleep. Every creak of the house made me sit up. Every shadow outside the blinds made me freeze. The comfort of suburbia had been ripped away, leaving only the raw truth. Evil doesn't always come from strangers lurking in alleyways. Sometimes it's the house next door, waving at you over the fence, smiling with cookies in hand. Eventually, Mom and I moved again. We found an apartment where neighbors shared walls but not lives. The anonymity was a relief. No one asked too many questions. No one lingered at the fence. I still think about Bellevue sometimes, about Jessica and her brother, about the way trust can turn into terror when you least expect it. The moral I carry is simple. Not everyone who greets you with a smile has good intentions. Some people wear friendliness like a mask, hiding something darker beneath. And it's better to trust your instincts than to give the wrong person the benefit of the doubt. Because sometimes the real danger lives right next door. I was 21 when I finally thought I'd figured things out. College life in Madison wasn't cheap, and my old apartment had been draining every dollar I made from my part-time job at the campus bookstore. The walls there were paper thin, the neighbors partied every night, and I could barely think, let alone study. When my lease ended, I promised myself I'd find something quieter, something better. The place I landed seemed like a dream at first. It was a small brick apartment complex tucked behind a row of maple trees that turned fire red in autumn. The rent was cheap, the streets were quiet, and most of the tenants were older couples or families with little kids. My unit, 3A, had a tiny balcony, just enough space for a chair and a plant. I thought I'd finally found a place where I could breathe, study, and focus on finishing my degree without distractions. That was before I noticed the man in 3B. He moved like a shadow. I'd see him sometimes on his balcony, standing perfectly still, facing outward, as if he were staring at something miles away. Other times I'd pass him in the hallway. He was tall, thin, with pale skin and dark hair hidden under a hood he seemed to wear no matter the season. He never spoke, never waved, just stood there. The first time I tried to greet him, it was out of habit. I came home from a late class, and there he was in the hallway, standing near his door like he had been waiting for something. "Evening," I said, my voice a little too chipper. His eyes flicked toward me. No words, no nod, just that blank, frozen stare. It made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't explain. At first, I told myself he was just shy or maybe socially awkward. College had taught me plenty about how people handled social interaction differently, and I didn't want to judge too quickly. But over the weeks, his silence began to feel less like shyness and more like something deliberate. There was no attempt at friendliness, no attempt at being neighborly. Only that watchful, unsettling presence. It became a rhythm I couldn't escape. I'd leave for class in the morning and he'd be standing on his balcony, hood up, not moving. I'd come home at night and he'd be in the hallway, leaning against the wall, eyes fixed on nothing, or maybe on me. Always there, always silent. I didn't know then how much that silence would get inside my head, how it would change the way I lived, the way I slept, the way I trusted the people around me. Back then, I just thought it was odd. Unsettling, sure, but harmless. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first real sign that something was off came with small, almost laughable details. My doormat disappeared. It was a cheap one from Target, the kind with faded letters that said, "Welcome." I figured maybe the wind blew it away or some kids grabbed it as a joke. 3 days later, it reappeared, but dirty, soaked through as if it had been left outside during a storm. Then my mail started arriving opened. At first I blamed the post office. Mistakes happen, right? But then I found a bill folded differently than I remembered, with the crease uneven like someone had thumbed through it quickly before slipping it back inside the envelope. I wanted to believe I was overthinking, but things escalated. One night, while I was cramming for a midterm, I heard tapping on my door. Light at first, then steady. I froze. Bella, my dog back at my parents' house, wasn't here to comfort me, just silence. I crept to the peephole, heart thudding, but the hallway was empty. I tried to laugh it off the next day, telling a friend at the library, "Guess I'm just psyching myself out." She shrugged and said, "Maybe it's just the building settling." But I knew what tapping sounded like, and that wasn't it. Then came the footprints, It was early morning when I noticed them, muddy prints leading down the hallway. I bent down to study them and felt my stomach tighten. They started at 3B and ended right in front of my door. Not past it, not around it. Just there. Staring at that mud drying against my welcome mat, I felt like someone had pressed a hand against my chest and wouldn't let go. I told myself it could have been a delivery guy, maybe even a kid visiting someone else. But deep down, I already knew who had left those prints, and I hated that I didn't know why. It got worse. One night, after a long study session at the library, I trudged home around midnight. The stairwell was dim, only one bulb flickering near the second-floor landing. Halfway up, I froze. My neighbor stood on the stairs above me, hood pulled low, hands in his pockets, staring down. I gripped the railing, every muscle in my body screaming to run, but my legs moved me forward anyway. "Excuse me," I muttered, my voice shaking. I slid past him, heart pounding so hard I thought he'd hear it. He didn't move, didn't react. He just turned his head slightly, tracking me as I fumbled my keys into the lock and slammed my door shut behind me. I sat there on the floor, breath shallow, listening for footsteps. Nothing. I stopped inviting friends over. How could I explain this without sounding paranoid? Even my girlfriend rolled her eyes when I told her. "Maybe he's just socially awkward," she said. "Not everyone's a people person." But awkward didn't explain standing silently in stairwells at midnight. Awkward didn't explain muddy footprints stopping at my door. Awkward didn't explain the doorknob. One morning I reached for my door handle to head to class and it was damp. Not from condensation. Madison was still cold that spring, but clammy, like someone's sweaty hand had been holding it for too long. That was the morning I decided to check the cheap hallway camera I'd set up weeks earlier, half as a joke. I scrubbed through hours of footage until my stomach flipped. 2:47 a.m. My neighbor in his hoodie, standing outside my door, hand on the knob. He didn't jiggle it, didn't push, just stood there for nearly 5 minutes, gripping it. Then he let go and walked silently back into 3B. I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I replayed it, hoping I was wrong, that it was some trick of the light. But it was him. It was real. And it was terrifying. I took the footage to the building manager. She was an older woman who lived on site and prided herself on knowing everyone. When I showed her, she frowned but shrugged. "I'll talk to him," she said. He probably didn't mean anything by it. Didn't mean anything? Who grips their neighbor's doorknob at 3 in the morning for 5 minutes straight? The police weren't any better. I filed a report, showed them the footage. They nodded sympathetically, but the officer said, "Until he actually tries to break in, there's not much we can do." So I bought extra locks, door alarms, a wedge for the bottom of my door. My apartment became a fortress, but it didn't help me sleep. Every creak jolted me awake. Every shadow in the hallway camera made my chest tighten. And still, he was always there. On the balcony, staring straight ahead. In the laundry room, standing silently until I left. In the stairwell, motionless, blocking the way until I muttered, "Excuse me," and slipped by. It felt like I was being studied. Like I wasn't living next to a neighbor, but next to something unknowable, unreadable. A presence I couldn't escape. My grades slipped. I stopped staying late at the library because walking back alone made me sick with dread. I started cutting through different streets just to avoid running into him outside. But no matter what I did, he was always there. Silent. Watching. When graduation came, I didn't tell anyone my plans. I packed in the middle of the night, moving box by box into my car. I didn't want him to know. I didn't want him to see me leave. As I loaded the last bag, I glanced up at the building. His balcony light was on. A shadow stood there still as ever. I didn't wave, didn't look twice. I just drove away. I never went back. Now, years later, I live in a different city. I've got a good job, new friends, and neighbors who nod politely when we cross paths. But I can't shake the habit of checking peepholes twice. I can't walk past a balcony without scanning it for someone standing too still. The silence of that man still lingers in me. He never spoke a word, but somehow his silence was louder than anything else. What I learned is simple. Fear doesn't always come from threats shouted or fights started. Sometimes it comes from what isn't said, from the presence you can't explain, from the quiet eyes watching when they think you're not looking. And I learned to trust my instincts, because silence can be the most dangerous sound of all. When I was 22, I thought moving into my own place would feel like freedom. I had just finished another draining semester at community college while working back-to-back shifts as a barista downtown. My parents had moved out of state, and I wanted to prove to myself that I could manage without them. The cheapest option I could find was a basement-level apartment in Portland, Oregon, half buried into the ground, with windows just tall enough to peek above the sidewalk. It wasn't pretty. The walls smelled faintly of dampness, and the heating rattled in the winter. The ceilings were low enough that I felt boxed in sometimes. But it was mine, and after years of sharing rooms and couches that felt like a small victory, I bought secondhand furniture, strung a few warm lights across the walls, and tried to convince myself it was cozy instead of claustrophobic. The first few weeks went by quietly. I worked long shifts, came home exhausted, ate cheap pasta, and fell asleep to the hum of the heater. I barely paid attention to the neighborhood, just row after row of small aging houses with peeling paint and quiet front gardens. And then I noticed her. She lived directly across the street in a narrow 2-story house with curtains that never seemed to close. Every evening when I walked home, I saw her framed in the window. A woman in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, with dark hair pulled back tight and a pale face lit by the glow of her living room lamp. She didn't smile or wave. She just watched. At first, I told myself it was nothing. People look out windows all the time. Maybe she was bored, maybe lonely. But when our eyes met, I raised a hand awkwardly, trying to be polite. She tilted her head, almost curious, but she didn't wave back. She kept staring until I ducked inside. It unsettled me, but I brushed it off. I was tired, overworked, probably imagining the tension in her gaze. That was what I told myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that every time I stepped outside, someone was keeping track. One rainy evening, I was juggling groceries at the gate of my little basement garden when I heard a voice behind me. "You shouldn't walk home alone this late." I turned so fast that one of my bags tore open, cans clattering onto the wet ground. She was standing at the edge of the garden, the woman from across the street. Up close, she looked older than I'd thought. Late 30s, maybe, but her eyes were sharp, almost too alert. "I'm Diane," she said softly, with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I live right across from you. I see everything from my window." It was such a strange way to introduce yourself that I didn't know how to respond. I forced a polite smile. "Thanks, I'll be careful." I gathered my groceries quickly and went inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself she was just lonely. Portland was full of people who lived quietly, drifting through their routines. Maybe she didn't mean anything by it, but Diane started showing up more often after that. She'd knock on my door at odd hours with flimsy excuses. "I saw your lights flicker. Are you okay? I heard you coughing. Do you need medicine?" Sometimes I'd open the door and no one would be there. Then I'd glance across the street and see her, standing in her window, watching. Always watching. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting, but every knock, every glance out the window made me more aware of her presence. She wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She was a constant shadow in my life. And the longer I lived there, the darker that shadow became. It was the little details that made my stomach twist. One evening, Diane caught me outside and said, "Your shift ended early today, didn't it? I saw you come home at 3:17. You looked tired." I froze. I hadn't told anyone my schedule. I hadn't even texted my friends. For her to know the exact time I walked through the gate meant she'd been watching every moment. Another time I came home to find a bouquet of flowers on my doorstep. No note, just fresh roses tied with string. Later that night, I discovered a letter slipped under my door in looping handwriting. "You don't need to feel alone anymore. I'm here, always watching, always caring." My hands shook as I read it. I tried to confront her the next day, cornering her as she stood outside her house. "Look, I don't know what you think you're doing, but this has to stop." She laughed lightly, brushing it off. "You should be grateful someone's paying attention to you. No one else is, right?" Her words cut sharper than I expected because she wasn't entirely wrong. My friends were busy, my parents were far away, and I'd been feeling isolated. But the way she said it, as if my loneliness gave her permission, made me want to scream. I started avoiding my own apartment. I slept on friends' couches, stayed late at work, did anything to avoid going home. But Diane noticed. She made comments about the clothes I wore when leaving, the people I walked with, even the music she heard through my thin windows. She wasn't just watching, she was keeping score. The night that broke me came in late February. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint crunch of footsteps in the garden. Heart pounding, I crept to the blinds and peered out. Diane was crouched in my garden, her face illuminated by the blue glow of her phone. She wasn't photographing flowers or the street. She had the camera angled directly at my bedroom window. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a lamp. My shaking fingers dialed 911. When the officers arrived, she was already back across the street, standing calmly on her porch as though she'd been there all along. "She's imagining things," Diane told them smoothly. "I was just getting some fresh air. That girl is dramatic." The officers gave her a warning but told me they couldn't do more without proof of a break-in. I felt like the ground had been ripped out beneath me. For weeks I lived in a constant state of panic. I kept the blinds shut tight, stuffed towels against the cracks in the windows, and slept with my phone clutched in my hand. But no matter what I did, I felt her gaze through the walls, through the curtains. Then, 2 weeks later, I came home from work and froze. My door was unlocked. Inside, nothing was missing, but on my bed lay a single piece of paper, another letter in that same looping handwriting. "You sleep so peacefully. I almost didn't want to leave." My knees gave out. I sat on the floor gasping until I could call my parents. By midnight, I had a bag packed and was gone. With the help of the building manager and the police, I broke my lease within the week. Diane was officially warned and told not to contact me again, but no charges stuck. The word they used was eccentric, not dangerous. I moved back in with my parents for a while, then found another place across town, this time in a busy apartment complex where neighbors minded their own business. But even years later, I can't sleep without blackout curtains. I double-check every lock, every latch, before closing my eyes. I still remember her voice, soft and steady. "I see everything from my window." That's what lingers with me. The realization that someone can invade your life without ever stepping fully inside. That walls and locks mean nothing if someone is determined to stand just close enough, watching until you break. The lesson I carry is simple but painful. Pay attention to your instincts. When someone's attention feels wrong, it probably is. Not every smile means kindness, and not every neighbor is just being friendly. Because sometimes the real danger isn't hiding in the dark. It's standing right across the street, smiling through the glass, waiting to be let in. When I signed the lease on that little one-bedroom apartment in Sacramento, I thought it was exactly what I needed. It was the summer of 2021, and my life was in pieces after ending a 7-year relationship that had consumed most of my 20s. I was 28, teaching art at a local high school, and desperate for a place that felt like mine. The apartment wasn't new by any means. The floors creaked under every step, the plumbing rattled like bones in the pipes, and the air conditioner struggled against the Sacramento heat. But there were tall windows that let in long streaks of sun, a balcony that overlooked the tree-lined street, and just enough space to set up my easel in the corner. I told myself it was a fresh start, and I filled the walls with my own paintings, trying to drown out the emptiness with color. That first week, I met my next-door neighbor. His name was Mark. Mid-40s, thinning hair combed carefully over, a strange sort of intensity in his smile that made me shift uncomfortably. He introduced himself as I carried a box of brushes up the stairs. "Artists always make such colorful neighbors," he said, his eyes flicking toward the canvases sticking out of the box. "Don't worry, I'm quiet. I keep to myself. I'm always here." The way he lingered on the word always caught me off guard, but I laughed politely, brushed it off, and went inside. I figured he was just one of those eccentric types, the kind of person you nod at in the hallway but don't linger with. For the first few weeks, things were normal enough. I threw myself into teaching and painting, keeping busy so I wouldn't dwell on the loneliness that crept in at night. But slowly, small details began to gnaw at me. A brush I swore I'd left on my easel was tucked neatly into a drawer. A mug I'd set by the sink was turned handle side out, like someone had placed it there deliberately. I told myself it was stress. Maybe I was distracted. Maybe I was clumsy. And then one evening, while vacuuming under the couch, I found a hairpin. Not just any hairpin, one of mine. A gold one I hadn't worn since the winter before. It shouldn't have been there. That was the first night I started to feel the uneasy sense that someone else was arranging my life without me knowing. It got harder to explain away when the notes began. At first, I thought they were some kind of prank. Small slips of paper slid carefully under my door, written in neat, careful handwriting. "The red dress suits you best. Your balcony plants looked thirsty, so I helped." I remember reading that second note over and over again, my stomach twisting tighter each time. My balcony didn't share a wall with his side of the building. For him to water my plants, he would have had to step inside my apartment. I told myself maybe he'd seen me wearing the red dress through the window. Maybe he'd been exaggerating about the plants, but the dread wouldn't leave. I stopped leaving the windows open at night. I double-checked the locks twice before bed. Still, things kept shifting. A stack of canvases I hadn't touched was leaned against the opposite wall. A pair of earrings I hadn't worn in months showed up in my bathroom sink. It was subtle, almost playful, like someone was testing how much I noticed. One night, I bumped into Mark in the hallway. He was holding a box, smiling like we were old friends. "You've really brightened up that apartment," he said casually. "It's like walking past a little gallery every day." I noticed the details. Something in his tone made my skin crawl. I forced a tight smile and excused myself quickly, fumbling with my keys to get inside. I started to feel watched in my own home. Not just the occasional glance through the blinds, but constantly, like every step I took, every brushstroke, every moment was being cataloged. It wasn't long before I realized it wasn't paranoia. I bought a small camera, the kind you can stick on a shelf and connect to your phone. It felt dramatic, like I was overreacting, but I needed proof. 2 nights later, I had it. The footage began at 3:15 a.m. My front door eased open, slow and deliberate. Mark stepped inside barefoot, moving with eerie calm as though he belonged there. He didn't look through drawers or take anything. Instead, he wandered. His fingers traced the edge of my easel, the frame of a painting, the rim of a coffee mug. He walked into the living room like a guest in someone else's house, pausing occasionally to tilt his head and admire. Then he stopped outside my bedroom door. He didn't touch it, but he stood there for nearly a full minute listening to me breathe. Finally, he turned back to the desk. He placed a small glass jar on top, looked around once more, and left as silently as he'd entered. When I woke up, the jar was still there. Inside was a bundle of my hair, tied neatly with red thread. I don't remember sitting down. I just remember shaking, gasping for air, replaying the footage until my vision blurred. That was the moment I stopped doubting myself. I called the police, my voice breaking as I explained. The officers came quickly, reviewing the footage with grim expressions. They knocked on Mark's door, and I heard the muffled conversation through the wall. He denied everything, of course, said I was imaginative, that I must have staged it somehow. But the jar was undeniable. They took him in for questioning, though he was released later that night. The building manager pulled me aside the next day, his voice low. "He's been a problem before," he admitted. "Other tenants complained about him borrowing things, letting himself in. He was evicted twice from other places, but no one ever pressed charges." The words made me feel sick. He'd been doing this for years, slipping in and out of people's lives like a shadow, and no one had stopped him. I changed the locks. I added more cameras, but no amount of security could erase the image of him standing outside my bedroom door, listening like he had a right to be there. Every creak in the hallway set my nerves on fire. Every soft thud in the night felt like the start of another intrusion. I stopped sleeping. I stopped painting. For 2 weeks, I lived in a state of constant dread. And then I couldn't do it anymore. I packed up what I could fit into my car and left. I told myself I'd come back for the rest, my easel, my canvases, the paintings that had once meant so much. But I couldn't bring myself to. The thought of touching brushes he'd handled, of standing in the space where he'd walked freely, made my stomach twist. I abandoned them like they were contaminated. I moved into a new apartment across town, one with heavy locks, a doorman, neighbors who kept to themselves. It should have felt safer. But even now, years later, I wake in the middle of the night convinced someone's standing outside my door. I still check the locks 3-4 times before bed. And I still have dreams where I wake to find him standing in my room, smiling like he belongs. The lesson I carry with me is one I wish I didn't have to learn. Evil doesn't always announce itself with violence or break down the door. Sometimes it walks in quietly, collects pieces of your life and convinces itself it belongs to you. And sometimes, the people you think of as neighbors are already closer than you can bear. I still remember the autumn of 2014 as if it were pressed between the pages of an old book. Dry leaves crunching under my sneakers, the crisp Cincinnati air carrying the smell of fireplaces, and the weight of starting over heavy on my shoulders. I was 17, a high school senior, and my parents' divorce had just redrawn the borders of my world. My mom and I moved into a duplex on the east side of town. The place wasn't much, 2 small bedrooms, creaky stairs, a kitchen that smelled faintly of mildew no matter how much my mom scrubbed. But it was a clean slate. For the first time in my life, I had my own room. No more listening to my dad pacing angrily down the hall. No more pretending not to hear my parents shouting through the thin walls of our old house. I told myself this was better. I told myself I could focus on school, finish strong, and move on to college. I even started to feel lighter, like maybe this new chapter would actually bring peace. That's when I met our neighbor. Her name was Vanessa Clark. She lived in the other half of our duplex, a woman in her early 30s with dark hair she kept tied back and a smile that always lingered just a second too long. I first saw her when I was hauling boxes from the car. She leaned casually over the porch railing, sipping from a mug, her eyes fixed on me like I was the only thing worth looking at on that street. "New neighbors," she called out, her tone bright and playful. "I'll have to keep an eye on you two." It struck me as odd, but I smiled politely. "Yeah, just moved in today," I said, setting down the box. "Well, welcome. I'm Vanessa. Don't be a stranger," she said with a smirk that didn't feel neighborly so much as personal. I brushed it off. Adults sometimes said weird things to teenagers, trying to sound relatable. She was just trying to be friendly, I told myself. But that first encounter was only the beginning. At first, her presence seemed harmless. She lingered on her porch when I left for school, asking casual questions about my classes, my favorite subjects, whether I had a girlfriend. She laughed easily, but her eyes stayed locked on me a little too long. Then came the baked goods. Muffins, cookies, banana bread, all delivered with little notes folded neatly inside the foil. "You work too hard, you need someone to take care of you. I notice you get home around 9 most nights. Be safe." The handwriting was careful, almost delicate. What unsettled me most was the detail. I hadn't told her my schedule. I hadn't mentioned staying late for basketball practice or grabbing food with friends. Yet she knew. One Saturday, I went to the small gym downtown to lift weights, a routine I rarely told anyone about. She was there. She waved from across the room and said, "I figured I'd try this place out." From then on, no matter what time I showed up, she was already there, waiting, watching, sometimes on the treadmill without even breaking a sweat, her eyes fixed on me in the mirror. Another time, my mom and I were at the grocery store. We turned down the next aisle and there she was, looking into our cart with a casual smile. "Looks like spaghetti night," she said. My mom laughed, oblivious, but my stomach dropped. At home, her presence grew heavier. My bedroom window faced the narrow alley between our units. One night, while texting a friend, I glanced up and froze. Vanessa stood in the dark, her face just visible in the glow of my phone light, staring directly at me through the glass. I yanked the blinds shut, heart racing. Seconds later, a soft knock tapped against the window, followed by her whisper, muffled but unmistakable. "Don't ignore me, Connor, we're closer than that." I told my mom. She sighed and set down her coffee. "Connor, she's probably just being friendly. You know how lonely people can get. Maybe you're misreading it." But I knew. The proof came a week later. I went into the garage to grab my bike and found photos taped to the handlebars. They were of me, walking to school, carrying my dog Bella on the leash, laughing with friends by the corner store. Each shot was zoomed, framed like someone had been studying me, not just snapping pictures. On the back of one, in that same neat handwriting, was a single line: "You belong here with me, not out there." I showed the photos to my mom. Her face drained of color. "We're going to the police," she said, no hesitation now. The officers came, listened, and walked over to Vanessa's unit. She laughed when they asked questions, brushing it off with a wave of her hand. "Teenage boys exaggerate," she said. "He probably wants attention." They left without action. My mom told me it would be fine, but her voice shook in a way that betrayed her own fear. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I bought a cheap motion-activated camera and hid it in the garage. That night I barely slept, listening for every sound. What I saw the next morning made my blood run cold. The footage showed the garage door creaking open at 2:14 a.m. Vanessa slipped inside, barefoot, holding her phone like a lantern. She moved slowly, almost reverently, touching my bike, picking up my basketball, lifting a sweatshirt I'd left hanging on a hook. And then, clear as day, she whispered my name. "Connor." Her voice was soft, trembling with something I couldn't name. She lifted her phone and snapped pictures of my things, of the empty garage, as if documenting her place in my life. I felt sick. The police couldn't dismiss it this time. They came back, reviewed the footage, and arrested her for trespassing, stalking, and harassment. I watched from the living room window as they walked her out in handcuffs. She didn't fight. She didn't even look embarrassed. She just turned her head, found my window and smiled. Neighbors whispered afterward. Some said they always thought she was odd, that she'd lived in the duplex for years and kept mostly to herself. Others claimed they'd seen her watching from her porch late at night. No one had imagined this. My mom and I packed quickly after that. We couldn't stay, not with the weight of her presence still hanging in the walls. We moved across town within 2 weeks, leaving behind the little duplex we had once hoped would be a new beginning. You'd think that moving would erase the fear, but it followed me. At night, I'd wake certain that someone was at my window. Every creak in the new house felt like a footstep in the hallway. I stopped going to the gym, stopped posting on social media, stopped walking Bella past familiar streets. It's been years since then, but I still carry the mark of it. Trust doesn't come easily anymore. I don't wave at neighbors, I keep my blinds closed. I double-check locks, triple-check sometimes, and even then I don't always sleep. The scariest part wasn't just what Vanessa did. It was how invisible it had been at first. How easily my mom dismissed it. How quickly others believed her laugh over my fear. She didn't need to break in with force. She slipped quietly, persistently, into my life, until it felt impossible to breathe without her watching. If there's a lesson I learned, it's this. Danger isn't always a stranger on a dark street. Sometimes it's the smile next door, the neighbor leaning on the porch rail, the voice telling you they're just being friendly. And by the time you see it for what it really is, they're already too close. By the spring of 2018, I thought I had finally untangled myself from the grip of my past. My name is Emily Rhodes, and at 26, I was trying to piece together a version of life that felt like mine. I had been freelancing as a graphic designer for almost a year, scraping by with enough contracts to pay bills, but never quite enough to feel steady. Rent was always a looming shadow, groceries a balancing act, but when I found a small duplex on Belmont Street in Portland, I signed the lease without hesitation. The unit wasn't glamorous. The kitchen tile was cracked, the windows drafty, and the pipes moaned like a restless ghost at night. But it was mine. It had space for my desk, my paints, and my quiet routines. For someone like me, someone who had walked away from a controlling relationship with Sean just months earlier, it was more than an apartment. It was sanctuary. I had cut Sean out of my life like a tumor. New phone number, deleted social media, a new address I didn't share widely. My parents and a few close friends knew where I was. But beyond that, I kept things guarded. He had been suffocating in his affection, texting constantly, demanding to know where I was, showing up uninvited. Every "I love you" had sounded more like a warning than comfort. By the time I left him, I was hollowed out, exhausted, desperate to breathe again. Belmont Street seemed to give me that. The neighborhood was lined with old maples that shaded the sidewalks, and in the evenings kids rode their bikes in loose circles on the asphalt. My upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, was a sweet widow who baked zucchini bread and left half loaves wrapped in foil at my door. She reminded me of my grandmother. I thought for the first time in years I was safe. But safety, I would learn, was only a fragile illusion. It shattered the first time I saw the man next door. The curtains of the neighboring unit had always been drawn, but one afternoon the door opened. I was locking up to head to the grocery store when he stepped out, pulling the door closed behind him. My chest locked up. It was Sean. At least that's what my brain screamed. The same messy brown hair, the same posture, the same faint smirk tugging at his mouth as if he knew me, owned me. I froze mid-step, keys clutched in my hand. But he didn't look surprised. He didn't even acknowledge the shock on my face. He just gave me a faint, almost knowing smile, and walked down the stairs as if this moment meant nothing. I stood there long after he disappeared, my heart hammering. Logic tried to intervene. The odds were impossible. Sean couldn't have tracked me here, not this quickly, not with every tie cut. And yet, that resemblance, it was uncanny enough to set every alarm in my body ringing. I told myself it was coincidence. It had to be. But deep down, something colder whispered. Escape wasn't going to be that simple. The first sign came in the form of roses. A bouquet on my porch, wrapped in cheap plastic, the stems still dripping. There was no name, no card. Just a note scribbled on white paper. Fresh starts don't mean forgetting the past. My stomach dropped. My first instinct was denial. Maybe it wasn't meant for me. Maybe a delivery mix-up. But the handwriting, it was careful, deliberate, and it carried a tone only someone who knew me would use. I knocked on Mrs. Callahan's door, clutching the flowers. "Did you see who left these?" She adjusted her glasses, peering at the bouquet. "No, honey, but I did see your neighbor standing outside your door earlier, looking, well, interested. He went back in before you got home." My throat tightened. I wanted to ask her more, but the concern in her eyes made me stop. I didn't want to scare her with my suspicions. The next day I gathered my nerve and knocked on my neighbor's door. No answer. But as I turned to leave, I caught the twitch of his curtains, like someone had been standing just out of sight. I waited, heart thudding, before finally retreating. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. That resemblance was messing with me. But things escalated quickly. I came home late one evening, exhausted. only to find my front door slightly ajar. My breath caught. I pushed it open cautiously. Nothing looked stolen, but when I walked through the living room, I froze. My framed photos of my parents, of my college friends, of me with Sean back when things were good, had all been turned face down. Every single one. My landlord brushed it off when I called. "Probably just a loose latch," he said dismissively. But I knew. I knew someone had been inside. That night, I slept with a chair jammed against the doorknob. I woke around 3 in the morning to the faintest sound of footsteps in the shared hallway. Slow, deliberate. Then the soft rattle of my doorknob. I pressed my back against the door, every nerve in me lit up, holding my breath until the sound stopped. I told myself again and again, it can't be him. But fear doesn't care about logic. Fear only cares about the sound of your door handle turning at 3 a.m. It was the discovery under my car that finally forced me to admit I wasn't imagining things. I was heading out for a client meeting when I noticed a piece of tape sticking out beneath my bumper. At first, I thought it was trash that had blown up against the car, but when I crouched down, my blood ran cold. A small black device was taped underneath, smooth, rectangular, with a blinking light I almost didn't catch. I pulled it free, my hands shaking. It was a GPS tracker. I drove straight to the police station, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The officer behind the desk examined the device and nodded grimly. "Yeah, that's a tracker. Someone's been monitoring your movements." My heart sank. "Can you arrest him? My neighbor. He looks like my ex, and I think—" The officer raised a hand gently. "We'll investigate, but without direct evidence tying it to him, our hands are limited. In the meantime, change your locks. Install cameras. Be cautious." It felt like a dismissal, even if it wasn't meant to. I left with a hollow pit in my stomach. That night, I ordered 2 security cameras online. When they arrived, I set them up. One aimed at my front door, the other covering the shared hallway. I checked them obsessively, sometimes every hour. For a while, nothing happened. And then one night, I caught him. The footage showed my neighbor standing outside my door at 2:41 a.m. His hood was pulled over his head, but his face tilted up into the lens. He didn't move, didn't knock, didn't try to force the door. He just stood there, staring directly into the camera, for nearly 5 minutes. Then he turned and slipped silently back inside his own unit. I couldn't breathe watching it. The stillness of him was more terrifying than if he'd tried to break in. It was deliberate. It was a message. The police came back after I showed them the footage. This time, they took it seriously. But nothing prepared me for what they uncovered. It wasn't Sean, the man who had been haunting me, who had left roses and notes and tracked my movements, wasn't my ex at all. His name was Evan. He'd only recently moved into the unit. The officers told me he bore a striking resemblance to Sean, enough that it explained my confusion. But what unsettled me most was what they said next. Evan remembered me from a cafe months earlier. He told them he'd recognized me, that he believed our meeting was fate, that he was only trying to look out for me. I felt sick. He had spun a fantasy in which my life was his to study, to monitor, to invade. They arrested him for trespassing and harassment. He was later released with restrictions, ordered not to contact me. But that did little to ease the dread that had rooted itself deep inside me. I stayed in the duplex only long enough to arrange a move. I packed quickly, leaving behind furniture I couldn't carry. Mrs. Callahan cried when I told her I was leaving. "You deserve peace, Emily," she said, holding my hand. But peace, I realized, was fragile. My new apartment had locks, cameras, stronger doors, but I never slept without pepper spray on the nightstand. Every sound at night still made me tense. Even now, years later, I live with the residue of that spring. I learned that sometimes it isn't your past that comes back to haunt you. It's the present wearing a familiar face. Evan wasn't Sean, but the resemblance had been enough to resurrect every ounce of fear I had worked so hard to bury. The truth is, danger doesn't need history to latch onto you. It doesn't need years of intimacy. Sometimes it only needs proximity, a shared wall, a passing glance in a cafe, a neighbor's door just steps away from your own. I still walk with my head high, but my trust is a fraction of what it used to be. I keep the cameras. I memorize every creak of my home. I measure people not by their smiles, but by the boundaries they respect. If there is one lesson my neighbor taught me, it's this. Safety isn't just about where you live. It's about knowing when to listen to that instinct that whispers when something feels wrong. Too often we dismiss it, rationalize it, or let others convince us we're paranoid. But instincts exist for a reason. I ignored mine at first, told myself it couldn't be real. But I'll never make that mistake again. Because the scariest truth I've learned is that not all chains are broken when you leave someone. Sometimes the ghost of them lingers in the face of another, and sometimes the neighbor you never chose is the one who tries hardest not to let you go. I never imagined Denver would feel so lonely. When my company transferred me from Chicago in late 2019, I convinced myself it was an opportunity, a chance to climb the corporate ladder, make good money, maybe start fresh. I was 32, single, and though the job paid well, the city felt foreign in a way that went deeper than geography. Chicago had been noisy, chaotic, alive. Denver, at least the part I moved into, was quiet to the point of discomfort. My townhouse sat in a row of near-identical units. Beige siding, trimmed hedges, two-car driveways lined up like cloned soldiers. People waved when I carried groceries in, but never stopped long enough for conversation. The silence was sharp at night, broken only by the hum of distant traffic or the occasional bark of a dog. That's probably why I noticed the man across the street so quickly. Every morning I left for work at exactly 7:15. I'm not much of a morning person, but my schedule was carved in stone. Shower at 6:30, quick breakfast, out the door by 1:15. And every morning, parked in the driveway opposite mine, was a silver sedan. The car would already be idling, exhaust puffing into the cold air. Inside sat a man, hands on the wheel, face shadowed by the windshield. At first I thought little of it. People had routines. Maybe he left for work when I did. But the pattern became unnerving. He never pulled out before me. He waited, always. The second I backed out, he'd shift into gear and leave, often sliding a few cars behind me in traffic. I tried not to obsess, but patterns are hard to ignore when you live alone. One morning, stuck at a red light, I glanced in my rearview mirror. There he was, 2 cars back, eyes fixed ahead, expression unreadable. My pulse jumped. That evening, I brought it up to a coworker over beers. It's weird, I admitted. Every morning he's there, same time, same place, and I swear he follows me. The guy shrugged, laughing it off. Maybe you just have the same schedule. Chill, man. I nodded, but I didn't feel chilled. If anything, the attention made me colder. There was something in the way the man waited, not coincidental but deliberate, like he wanted me to notice. It wasn't long before I did, and once I noticed, I couldn't unsee it. The first real crack in my denial came one late evening. Work had kept me at the office until after dark, and the neighborhood was hushed by the time I pulled into my driveway. That's when I saw it. The silver sedan sat parked directly across from me, headlights off, engine silent. But through the windshield, illuminated faintly by a nearby street lamp, I could see the man's silhouette. He wasn't fidgeting, not scrolling on his phone. He was just sitting, facing my house like a hunter in a blind. I tried to keep my face neutral as I stepped out of my car. That's when his window slid down with a faint whir. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "You always get home around this time," he said. "Long day?" The words were ordinary, but the context froze me. I muttered, "Yeah," forcing a weak smile before rushing up the steps and fumbling with my keys. I didn't exhale until the door was locked behind me. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the sound of his voice, the way he'd been watching for my arrival. Who sits in their car across from a neighbor's driveway just to point out their routine? I tried to break the pattern. The next morning I left earlier than usual at 6:30. Still, the sedan was there, engine running. The morning after, I left late, close to 8. Same thing, he lingered until I pulled out. I started altering my routes to work, taking side streets, detouring through neighborhoods. Yet more often than not, when I checked my mirror, the silver sedan appeared. A few cars back, not tailgating, not obvious, but present. The paranoia seeped into everything. I unplugged my TV at night so the glow wouldn't advertise my presence. I started parking around the block instead of in my driveway. My life, once structured and predictable, was now a mess of cautious improvisation. Finally, I called my sister back in Chicago. My voice cracked when I told her, "I think my neighbor is following me." She didn't laugh. "You need to go to the police, Ian, right away." I promised I would. But when the police showed up, the sedan was gone. No proof, no crime, nothing they could act on. They told me to keep an eye out. I already was, and what I saw next terrified me more than I could admit. It was the note that broke me. I came home one evening and spotted a slip of paper tucked beneath my front doormat. My first thought was delivery notice, maybe something from the HOA. But when I unfolded it, my chest went tight. In neat handwriting, it read, "You drive too fast on your way to work. One of these mornings you might not make it." The calmness of the phrasing made it more sinister. It wasn't a threat shouted in anger. It was an observation, a prediction. He had been watching closely enough to know how I drove. I sat on the couch, note trembling in my hand, heart pounding like I'd run a mile. This wasn't coincidence anymore. He wasn't just a neighbor with the same schedule. He was studying me. The next day I bought security cameras, 2 for outside, 1 for the living room window facing the street. Installing them, I felt both empowered and ashamed. How had I let this go so far? Why had I ignored my instincts? The first few nights the cameras picked up nothing but passing cars and the occasional cat. Then came the footage I can't forget. At 2:13 a.m., the man stepped out of the silver sedan. He walked slowly up my driveway, hands in his pockets. He stopped at my front door and just stood there staring for nearly 4 minutes. Then he turned, walked back to his car, and sat there another half hour before finally leaving. My stomach lurched as I watched. He hadn't tried to break in. He hadn't even touched the knob. But the intent was there, heavy in the stillness of his posture. He wanted me to know I was never unobserved. The police returned when I showed them the footage. This time their faces shifted. Something about seeing it on video, the silence of him just standing there, changed the equation. They promised to escalate the case, but I knew escalation meant things were about to get worse. The investigation moved quickly after that. I didn't know what to expect, but the police soon revealed that the man across the street wasn't just eccentric. He had a history, prior harassment charges in another state, neighbors who had filed complaints, even a restraining order years earlier. None of it had led to prison time, but the pattern was clear. They questioned him, impounded the silver sedan, and filed for a restraining order on my behalf. The HOA pushed him to move out, citing safety concerns. Within weeks, his driveway was empty, curtains drawn tight, but peace didn't come rushing back. I still checked the cameras obsessively, heart skipping every time a shadow passed. Walking to my mailbox after dark felt like a risk. On the road, every silver car made me grip the steering wheel tighter. One night, weeks after he'd gone, I sat in my living room staring at the blank TV screen. I realized I had stopped living. My life had shrunk to work and home, routines designed to avoid being watched. When I finally spoke to my sister again, she asked softly, "Do you feel safer now?" I hesitated before answering. "He's gone, but I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again." That was the truth. The man had left, but the damage lingered. It's been years since then, but the image still haunts me. A figure standing silently in my driveway at 2 a.m., patient, unblinking, certain that I belonged under his watch. I still live in Denver, though I moved out of that townhouse. My new place has higher fences, better locks, brighter lights. Cameras cover every angle. I drive routes that change weekly. Some might call it paranoia. I call it survival. The scariest part wasn't that he followed me. It was how normal it seemed at first. How easily I brushed off the signs, told myself it was nothing, convinced myself not to make a fuss. By the time I admitted the truth, the situation had spiraled into something dangerous. I've learned this. Danger doesn't always storm in loudly. Sometimes it parks quietly across the street, engine running, waiting for you to notice. If there's a lesson, it's that instincts are not to be ignored. If something feels off, it usually is. I wasted precious time second-guessing myself because I didn't want to seem paranoid. That hesitation almost cost me my peace, maybe more. Now, when I see headlights in my rearview mirror linger too long, I don't shrug it off. When someone's behavior strikes me as wrong, I act. Because it's better to be cautious and wrong than to be silent and right too late. And whenever I catch myself forgetting, I remember the silver sedan idling in the driveway across the street, its driver waiting, watching, as if my life were his to follow.